There are archives in the Imperium that no citizen, no soldier, no priest is ever meant to see. Not because they are dangerous to the body, but because they are dangerous to the idea of the Imperium. This story begins inside one of those forbidden vaults. The vault in question lies beneath the gray bastion of Terra, miles under the surface, past strata of rusted adamantium and labyrinths of forgotten prisons. The air down here is heavy with incense and machine oil. Servo skulls drift like pale insects. Every sound echoes forever. And at the center of the vault, illuminated by a single lumen lamp, sits a single data slate, Project Aeternum Proficia. The High Lords buried it for 10,000 years. They were right to, for inside the file lay a heresy wrapped in loyalty, loyalty sharpened into madness, madness refined into a plan. Reincarnation engine, phase Heraclean subject parameters. Charismatic military leader, unparalleled strategic aptitude, empirically proven ability to inspire total obedience. Historical reference seed, Terra, Age of Sail Earth, 18th to 19th millennium pre-imperial cycles. Target subject, Bonaparte, Napoleon. It was not created by the Mechanicus, nor by the Inquisition alone, but by a coalition of terrified visionaries convinced that the Imperium could no longer rely on the rare, unstable miracles of Primarch gene recovery. Humans could be reforged. Memory could be manipulated. History could be harvested like a corpse. That was the idea. And, as history has taught the Imperium many times, ideas can be deadlier than any demon. 2. The unholy designers, the architects of the project were not heroes. They were not villains. They were something far more dangerous, Imperial bureaucrats with imagination. There was Muggos Historicus Elterin, a machine priest who believed the past could be copied like a circuit. There was Inquisitor Veln, who claimed that humanity needed a commander untainted by political factions. There was Marshal General Vardek, who had lost 7 sons to the Tyranids and wanted a war leader who could win wars without hesitation. In secret conclaves beneath Terra, they debated names from humanity's long-buried ancient history. Hannibal Barca, Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, Qin Shi Huang, Julius Caesar, but only one name returned again and again, whispered with something close to awe, Napoleon Bonaparte. A man who rose from nothing, a mind that devoured battlefields whole, a figure who turned chaos into empire, and empire into legend. A worthy instrument of the Emperor's will, Veln had said, voice cracking like old parchment. A man born for conquest. And so the machine priests built the chamber. And so the Inquisition recovered fragments of long-dead DNA. And so the Imperium set in motion its most blasphemous experiment since the Horus Heresy. 3. The first failure, the early attempts nearly tore the vault apart. The reincarnation engine. An ugly mess of warp-tethered vats, memory seed injectors, and psi-dampening coils, kept producing malformed, broken things. Bodies without minds, minds without bodies, pulsing forms that lived only long enough to scream. Inquisitor Veln called these failures acceptable losses. Muggos Elterin called them predictable inefficiencies. The vault's sanitation servitors simply called them bio-waste code scarlet. But deep inside the Mechanicus databanks, a hidden log remained. Attempt 9. Failure. Warp bleed detected. Attempt X. Failure. Subject rejected mnemonic seed. Attempt 13. Catastrophic. Memory ghost intrusion. Attempt 16. Partial neural integrity. Unstable. And yet they continued, driven by fear or faith, it no longer mattered which. Until one cycle, with no more ceremony than the turning of a cog, the fluid in the stasis chamber calmed. The alarms fell silent. The memory seeds stabilized. And a faint pulse, regular, steady, confident, echoed across the chamber. It was the first stable heartbeat the project had ever produced. And it belonged to him. For the dream of a dead general for 12 years, the body floated in the stasis fluid, growing, stabilizing, waiting, but a twist emerged. When the memory seed activated, it did not simply copy the historical record. Something else awakened inside him. Fragments of dreams, half-remembered sensations, echoes of life long extinguished. He dreamed of the crash of cannon fire over European fields, the smell of wet earth after rain on foreign soil, the creak of ship timbers during exile, the weight of a crown that never truly fit, the bitter taste of defeat, and the stubborn refusal to accept it. At first, the watchers believed these were artifacts, random neurological noise. But the dreams grew sharper, more defined, more intentional. It was as if the soul itself were clawing its way back from extinction. One acolyte whispered in fear, "My lords, I think he remembers." And for the first time in Imperial history, a Mugos replied with something almost like dread. "Then may the Emperor protect us all." The politics of resurrection word of the successful subject leaked. First to the Ordos, then to the Officio Militaris, then to several factions who had been forbidden from involvement. Within months, what was once a secret project became a battleground of conflicting plans. Some factions wanted him as a propaganda icon. Others wanted him as a war leader. Others wanted him terminated before he complicated things. And a few, the wisest, wanted him sealed away forever. For though the Imperium had created a commander of remarkable potential, they had forgotten the most important truth of all. Napoleon Bonaparte had never been good at being controlled, and death had not improved that trait. 6. The final sealing 27 days before his scheduled awakening. An emergency declaration froze the project. A warp anomaly, brief, sharp, but unmistakably malignant, bloomed over the vault. Sanctioned psychers suffered seizures. Servoskulls fell from the air. The reincarnation engine flickered like a candle in a storm. No demons manifested, but the vault grew colder. Voices whispered in vents where no vents existed. Shadows stretched too long on the walls. The Inquisition panicked. Napoleon's sarcophagus was sealed, locked with sigils and adamantium clamps. The staff were mind-wiped or reassigned. The vault was abandoned, left to rot in bureaucratic darkness. And in that silent tomb, surrounded by dust and incense and forgotten prayers, a heartbeat continued, slow, patient, waiting. 7. The betrayal that changed everything centuries later. No one knows exactly how many. A new power rose within the Imperium. A faction desperate for order, terrified of civil collapse, convinced the Imperium needed a general unbound by current politics. They found hints of the old project, found the vault, found the sealed sarcophagus, and they made a single irreversible decision. Wake him, not out of faith, not out of devotion, but out of fear. Fear of orcs, fear of demons, fear of rebellion, fear of a galaxy devouring humanity piece by piece. And so they cracked the seals, and so the chamber stirred, and so the first breath of the War Master of the new Great Crusade echoed through a room that had not heard human voice in 10,000 years. The hook into Chapter 2, they believed they had awakened a weapon. They did not understand they had awakened a mind. A strategist who had bent nations to his will. A commander who saw patterns where others saw chaos. A man who turned defeat into opportunity, and opportunity into empire. And when he finally opened his eyes, confused, drenched in stasis fluid, gasping like a newborn, the vault whispered around him, "He has returned." But that was not the dangerous part. The dangerous part was this: he was already planning. When Napoleon awakened, his lungs burned like they were learning a forgotten skill. The air tasted of oxidized metal and incense, a sacred industrial blend unique to the Imperium. Every breath felt like an accusation. "You were brought back for a reason." As he stepped out of the sarcophagus, half blinded by flickering lumen lamps, he expected the crisp cold of a European morning, or the dry heat of Egypt, or even the humid mist of Elba. Instead, he felt the oppressive weight of recycled vault air, thin, dry, and heavy with the scent of machines that had not been maintained in centuries. He had awoken in a world that felt ancient, exhausted, and cruelly functional. He did not know it yet, but this was the daily reality of the Imperium he would be forced to lead. 2. Welcome to your crusade, War Master. The first humans, or what passed for humans, he saw were tech priests. Their robes were red, but stained black around the hems. Cables snaked from their robes like metallic vines. Their faces were mostly replaced by metal masks, expressionless, emotionless. One spoke through a vox implant, voice crackling with static. War Master, you are operational. Operational. Not alive. Not reborn. Operational. The tool. Napoleon hated that word instantly, but he said nothing because he was observing, just as he had always done in life. He catalogued their posture, their discipline, their fear, the fact that they stood in a semicircle. Like soldiers awaiting inspection, the Imperium had expected a weapon. They had gotten a commander. 3. The surface of Tormentum Prime, they transported him to the surface hours later. He did not receive a palace. No marble halls. No golden banners. Instead, the doors opened to a landscape that felt like the aftermath of every war he had ever fought. Tormentum Prime, an Imperial fortress world chosen as his staging ground. Napoleon's first impressions. The sky, a polluted yellow-gray, streaked with the trails of orbital ships. Thunder rolled so frequently that the air vibrated like a drum. The smell? Burnt ozone, wet rust, something faintly chemical drifting from smog-belching factories. The people thin, hollow-eyed, marching in work gangs, their boots sinking into mud the color of old blood. Not slaves, but not truly free either. They walked with exhaustion carved into their posture, and fear carved deeper still into their silence. Napoleon had seen suffering before, but this was an entire world engineered around suffering. A world where misery was not a failure, it was the system. 4. Daily life of the imperial masses. He watched from a balcony as civilians carried crates, tools, and ammunition across the courtyard below. None dared to speak above a whisper. He noticed the way overseers paced with shock batons, the way mothers clutched their children close near checkpoints, the way men hunched their shoulders as if hoping to become invisible, the way soldiers drilled with worn-out lasguns that sparked unpredictably. No music, no laughter, no time to dream, just endless work, fear, prayer, and hunger. A life where survival was the highest ambition. Napoleon murmured to himself, "People cannot fight if they cannot live." A nearby aide overheard and stiffened, unsure if the statement was treasonous. Napoleon didn't care. He had led armies before. He knew the truth. An empire built on fear alone would eventually collapse. But the Imperium had survived 10,000 years like this. That realization chilled him more than the cold vault air. The drill fields of desperation. He was taken next to the training grounds. Thousands of new conscripts, some barely adults, practiced formations. Their faces were gaunt, their uniforms patched in dozens of places, their rifles old, occasionally sparking when fired. A drill sergeant barked, "You are meat for the Emperor's grinder. Stand straight." Napoleon watched a soldier collapse mid-drill. Not out of weakness, but out of malnutrition. The sergeant shouted for medici. None came. Eventually, 2 fellow conscripts dragged the collapsed youth to the side and returned to formation without protest. Napoleon inhaled sharply. In his old world, he had seen soldiers die. But they died in battle, not in practice fields. Here, death was ordinary, expected, routine. He realized he was not inheriting an army. He was inheriting a bleeding wound shaped like an empire. 6. The rituals of faith every evening. Alarms sounded across the fortress. Workers stopped whatever they were doing. Soldiers halted their drills. Administrators laid down their quills. A priest, draped in bone charms and purity seals, recited prayers over vox speakers. Humanity endures by sacrifice. The Emperor watches. Obedience is survival. Thousands repeated the prayers in unison. Not because they truly believed, but because failing to repeat them meant punishment. Napoleon observed from a balcony, arms crossed. He whispered, "An empire sustained by fear alone is brittle." One of the priests heard him. His eyes narrowed. The war master had been awake for only a day, and already the political game had begun. 7. Whispers in the barracks. That night, Napoleon walked through the barracks. He listened without announcing himself. He heard soldiers complaining about hunger, a mother whispering hope to her sick child, veterans muttering about deployment against orcs, officers arguing over lack of ammunition, a group of young recruits telling stories of legendary heroes, even though they barely understood what hero meant anymore. Every voice carried a weight, not just of struggle, but of resignation, the kind that creeps into a society over centuries until it becomes invisible. He stopped by a dim corner where a group of soldiers warmed their hands near a thermal vent. One asked quietly, "Do you think the new War Master will be any different?" Another snorted, "If he was born in the Imperium, he's already doomed." Napoleon stepped back into the shadows, unseen. He understood. He would have to earn their loyalty, not through titles, not through fear, but through competence. The Imperium had awoken a strategist. Now they would reap the consequences. 8. The hook into Chapter 3. As night settled over Tormentum Prime, Napoleon stood alone on a watchtower. The sky above churned with storm clouds and distant fire from orbital shipyards. The air hummed with machinery and distant artillery tests. He finally understood the truth. He had not been brought back to command a healthy empire. He had been brought back to save a dying one. And somewhere deep in his mind, a familiar fire kindled. Ambition, strategy, vision. But the galaxy did not wait. For in the darkness beyond Tormentum Prime, a new threat stirred, one that would test him before he ever commanded a single regiment. Tomorrow, he would learn that the Imperium's daily life was miserable. But its horrors were only beginning. Napoleon learned quickly that the Imperium did not run like an empire. It ground forward, like a colossal engine built from bureaucracy layered on bureaucracy, rituals masquerading as maintenance, fear disguised as loyalty, and suffering treated as fuel. Tormentum Prime was no exception. Here, the so-called administrative centers felt less like offices and more like punishment chambers for paperwork. Every cog, every desk, every person existed only to serve the engine. The irony wasn't lost on Napoleon. In his old life, he had forged an empire through precision, reform, and efficiency. Here, efficiency was heresy. The Imperium survived not because it was well run, but because it was too big, too angry, and too afraid to die. And yet this was the machine he was now expected to command. 2. The Adeptus Ministorum. Faith as a leash. The first institution Napoleon formally met was the Adeptus Ministorum, the ecclesiarchy. They arrived in procession. Priests draped in parchment and purity seals, censers swinging thick incense, servo skulls chanting litanies, guards carrying icons of the emperor. They looked less like clergy and more like executioners wearing holy symbols. The high confessor bowed stiffly. "War Master, the emperor's light guides your rebirth." Napoleon remained silent long enough for the confessor to sweat beneath his robes. Then he simply replied, "Light is useful only when it lets us see clearly." A few nearby priests exchanged glances. The confessor forced a smile. The message was clear. The War Master was not a puppet. This made him dangerous. 3. The Adeptus Administratum. A maze of madness. Next came the Administratum. They did not greet Napoleon with prayers. They greeted him with paperwork so dense it could smother a planet. Stacks of deployment schedules. Lists of food shortages. Requests for reinforcements written in fragmented Gothic. Audits of ammunition that had not existed for decades. One scribe, shaking from exhaustion, handed him a data slate. "War Master, we require your approval on ration reallocations for Sector Columnus." Napoleon skimmed the numbers. The math was outrageous. 2 billion people allocated less grain than a single regiment required. He raised an eyebrow. "These numbers are impossible." The scribe bowed. "Yes, War Master. That is the standard." That sentence stayed with Napoleon for the rest of the day. 4. Punishment as normalcy. Napoleon was escorted across a courtyard where citizens were lined up, watched by commissars and administrative enforcers. Their crimes were small. Speaking during prayer, failing to complete work quotas, arguing with overseers, showing signs of fatigue. Punishments were public not to deter crime, but to justify the system. Napoleon didn't witness anything graphic. The Imperium did not need gore to make its point. Just fear. Just silence. Just the knowledge that you existed at the mercy of institutions older than your civilization. A young worker trembled as an overseer lectured him in front of the crowd. Napoleon leaned toward an attending officer. Is every infraction treated like this? The officer answered, War Master. Everything is an infraction. Napoleon exhaled slowly. This was not an empire. This was a massive, suffocating habit. A civilization stuck in its own ritualized cruelty. The commissariat. Fear-given uniform, the commissars greeted Napoleon with perfect salutes and perfectly cold eyes. Their uniforms were immaculate, black coats, red piping, and caps like iron halos of authority. Their leader, Commissar Major Felborn, spoke crisply, War Master, morale is our domain. Napoleon studied the man before responding, Morale? Or obedience? Felborn didn't blink. Both. The difference is irrelevant. Napoleon understood instantly. These were not political officers like in old Earth armies. These were walking embodiments of fear, trained to enforce loyalty through intimidation, discipline, and, if necessary, final measures. Not cruelty for cruelty's sake. Cruelty because the state demanded it. Felborn continued, War Master, in the Imperium, hope is inefficient. Fear is reliable. Napoleon gave a thin, humorless smile. In my experience, Commissar, soldiers fight hardest when they believe they can win. Felborn's expression did not change, but his silence was the kind that carried meaning. 6. The planetary governor. A ruler in shackles, the governor of Tormentum Prime was not a tyrant. He was a prisoner with a crown. When Napoleon met him, he found a pale, exhausted man buried in paperwork and surrounded by armed guards for his protection. The governor bowed deeply. War Master, please forgive the state of my world. Napoleon responded politely. I have seen enough to know the truth. The governor's expression cracked. Not into fear, but into relief. Then you understand, my lord. This world does not belong to me. It belongs to the administratum, the ministorum, the commissariat. I sign decrees, but others hold the knife. Napoleon absorbed this quietly. A leader without authority. An empire without cohesion. A world ruled by a dozen fists instead of one mind. In his old life, he had crushed such inefficiencies. Here, he was expected to tolerate them. 7. An empire of static motion. As the day ended, Napoleon observed the fortress city from a high balcony. He saw fields of work gangs laboring without rest, priests chanting at every hour, commissars patrolling like shadow judges, scribes carrying stacks of documents larger than themselves, officers arguing over supply numbers that made no sense, civilians moving with the silent dread of people born into oppression, manufacturers belching fire like ancient volcanoes, and the distant glow of orbital shipyards flickering like dying stars. This was the Imperium's rhythm. Not living, not thriving, just enduring, every second a struggle, every life a cog. Napoleon whispered to himself, no empire should function like this. But then he corrected himself. No empire should survive like this. And yet the Imperium had. For 10,000 years. That paradox would shape every decision he made from this moment on. 8. The hook into Chapter 4. Night fell over Tormentum Prime like a heavy shroud. Napoleon stood alone in his quarters, reviewing endless lists of troop deficits, supply shortages, political restrictions, and impossible expectations. Then a Vox operator burst into the room, pale, shaking, eyes wide with dread. War Master, we've intercepted an emergency astropathic distress signal. Napoleon looked up slowly. From where? The operator swallowed. A frontier mining colony, my lord. They report a sighting. Something in the void. Napoleon frowned. Orcs. The operator shook his head violently. No, War Master. Something worse. Silence stretched. In the next heartbeat, the fortress alarms began to howl across the night. The machinery of oppression was about to be joined by something far more terrifying, the machinery of war. The first march of the reclaimed legion, the ships rattled. Not from turbulence, nor from weapons fire, but from something subtler, the unmistakable groan of a starship trying to remember what hope felt like. Even in the dim red lighting of the troop holds, you could feel it. Tension, pressure, an ache. The kind of ache soldiers feel right before a battle they do not fully understand. We were still weeks away from the first target world of the new Great Crusade, but Napoleon, our Napoleon, insisted the mobilization begin now. He said, "Order must arrive before victory, discipline before destiny." And so, Chapter 4 opens where the true crusade begins. In silence, routine, and the weight of a legend returning to life. The muster deck, the air smelled of machine oil, recycled sweat, and old fear clinging to the walls. The mustering deck stretched across 3 hull segments, with thousands of troopers standing in regulated blocks. A sight that would have impressed even the most seasoned Imperial commissar. Napoleon walked the line personally, not as a distant figure on a dais, but there, boots echoing on cold metal, eyes sharp as a razor. The soldiers watched him as if he was part myth. Perhaps he was. But myths normally didn't study each soldier, as if trying to decide who would live and who would simply slow him down. We stood straighter as he passed. Everyone did. You couldn't help it. Behind him floated hololithic tactica scrolls, ancient maps of Imperial sectors twisted by warp storms, labeled in his crisp, almost annoyingly precise handwriting. If the Emperor himself had ever kept neat notebooks, they would look like Napoleon's. He spoke without turning. Discipline is a language. If you speak it fluently, the galaxy listens. Nobody breathed for a moment. Then he added, "If not, chaos listens instead." We swallowed hard. That is why it decays. Warstein stiffened like he'd been slapped. Napoleon continued, walking past him. "We begin the march now. Command will adjust." Every officer in the room knew the truth. Napoleon had just declared independence from imperial bureaucracy, which is to say, a minor heresy. But useful heresies are tolerated. Sometimes. 3. The first war sermon the chaplains expected to lead the pre-crusade rites. Napoleon had different ideas. We assembled in the viewing bay, the warp storms painting violent blues and purples across the armored glass. The atmosphere hummed, as if the ship itself waited for instructions. Then he stepped forward. Napoleon did not give sermons. He gave orders that felt like revelations. "You fear the galaxy," he said, "because you see chaos, mutation, decay." A pause. "We will give it something else to fear." Murmurs rippled through the ranks. He turned slightly, profile lit by the flickering light of a distant nebula. "The Imperium has forgotten the meaning of crusade. It sends bodies, not purpose. We send both." Something in us shifted. Not hope, the Imperium never allowed that, but a kind of pressure, a tightening inside the chest, like the moment before charging into fire. When he finished, the silence was absolute. Then the chanting began. Not liturgical hymns. Something older. Something simple. Vive l'Empereur. The ship vibrated with it. Napoleon stood completely still. For a heartbeat, something unreadable passed across his expression. A shadow, maybe regret, maybe pride. Hard to tell. He whispered, barely audible, "At last! An army again." 4. The first mini cliffhanger as the chanting reached its peak. The alarms suddenly blared. Warp proximity warning. Anomaly detected. Something massive approaching from the storm. The lights dimmed. The deck groaned. And then a single astropath screamed. Not a normal scream. A warped one like reality folding. He collapsed, clutching his head, repeating one phrase in a trembling voice. "He knows." Napoleon's eyes narrowed. "Who?" The astropath's lips quivered. "The other one. The one who remembers you." Every soldier froze. Only Napoleon stepped closer to the viewing glass. In the heart of the warp surge, a silhouette formed, vast, armored, unmistakable. Pre-march. Watching. Waiting. And then the anomaly dissipated, as if it had never been. But the message remained. Napoleon was not the only legend preparing for war. That was only the beginning. The first target of the new Great Crusade, the choice of the First World, was deliberate. Napoleon believed a crusade should begin not with glory, but with obedience. Before banners rise, before hymns echo, before fleets burn through the void, a crusade must prove itself capable of bending reality back into shape. So he chose a world broken by stagnation, a world that embodied everything wrong with the Imperium, a world that, ironically, had once been a beacon. Gaius Ultima, the descent. A planet that sleeps with its eyes open, we entered atmosphere at dawn. The sky was a bruised gray, the kind of color that feels like the planet has forgotten sunlight. Ash drifted across the upper clouds, even though no fires burned. A perpetual, exhausted smog. Napoleon stood at the forward viewport, hands behind his back, saying nothing. He didn't need to. The planet told its own story. Cities arranged in perfect pre-imperial grids, now half-collapsed. Factories that once supplied entire sectors, now silent, rusting, their chimneys drooling smoke out of habit more than function. Streets packed with people who moved like ghosts, not dead, but not living either. It was the most loyal kind of imperial misery, the kind nobody questions anymore. Napoleon watched it with the eyes of someone seeing a battlefield that had died before the battle even started. He exhaled. Here, he said quietly, is where the Imperium loses wars long before they begin. 2. The governor's palace. The moment our landing craft touched the surface, protocol demanded the governor greet us. He did. Eventually, Governor Erastes was a soft man wearing hard metals. His armor was ceremonial, his stride unsteady, his smile oily enough to water a garden. He bowed too deeply, spoke too loudly, and insisted he had everything fully under control. That was a lie. Napoleon could smell lies the way hounds smell blood. Inside the palace, the air was heavy with perfume. Too heavy, like someone terrified of revealing what the place really smelled like underneath. Servitors polished floors already clean. Tapestries depicted military victories the governor had not been alive to witness. Napoleon walked past all of it without slowing. "Tell me, governor," he said, "how many regiments you field at full strength?" Erastes hesitated, a heartbeat too long. Then, 4. Napoleon didn't stop walking. Correct answer 1. And barely. A bead of sweat slid down the governor's cheek. We followed silently behind Napoleon, trying not to stare at the man's fear. But everyone saw it, and Napoleon wanted him afraid. Fear makes people reveal the truth faster than interrogation. 3. The truth below the palace. What Napoleon sought wasn't above the surface. It was below. He demanded access to the underhabs, the abandoned industrial districts where the workers lived, or failed to. The governor tried to protest, babbling excuses about sanitation and ongoing repairs. Napoleon simply stared at him. The conversation ended there. We descended into the lower levels. The stench hit first. Chemical residue, sweat, and stale air that hadn't circulated properly in years. The lights flickered, buzzing with that unnerving electrical hum that always sounds faintly like whispers. Workers watched us from the shadows. Thin, exhausted, eyes like burnt-out candles. Napoleon paused before a collapsed manufactorum door. He brushed dust from a rusted aquila carved into the metal. "This," he said softly, "was once pride." Then he turned. "Now it is rot." A child approached him, barefoot, wrapped in oversized rags. She looked up at Napoleon without fear. "Are you another one?" she asked. Napoleon crouched to eye level. "Another what?" "A visitor who promises things." Napoleon did not smile. "I do not promise," he said. "I reorganize." The girl blinked, unsure whether that was good or bad. We weren't sure either. 4. The rot behind the city walls. We reached the central pump station, the heart of the settlement's water supply. Half the pumps were broken. The other half were sabotaged. Not by chaos, not by Xenos, by the governor's own enforcers, who redirected water to the upper districts as a method of control. Control through thirst, the purest, simplest cruelty. Napoleon stood perfectly still, surveying the ruined machinery, the cracked pipes, the improvised ration locks. Silence. Then, Governor Erastes, Napoleon said without turning. You have ruled through neglect. Erastes swallowed. My lord, You have maintained order by letting your people decay slowly, hoping misery would pacify them. No, please, Napoleon finally turned around. His voice remained calm. You have misinterpreted decay as stability. Erastes fell to his knees. Napoleon did not look at him again. To the soldiers, he gave a single command. Arrest him, the governor screamed. Not because of torture, just fear of losing power. In the Imperium, that fear is often louder than pain. The hook into Chapter 6. The first true obstacle as the soldiers hauled the disgraced governor away. One of the under-high foremen approached nervously. Sire, Lord Commander, there's something else. Napoleon raised an eyebrow. The foreman swallowed, then pointed toward the far edge of the ruined plains, a stretch of cracked ground leading into the bleak horizon. We found signals. Not ours. Someone's been broadcasting. A lot. Out there. Napoleon stepped closer. What kind of signals? The foreman hesitated. Recruitment signals. For whom? Napoleon asked. The foreman's voice dropped to a whisper. For a warlord who claims he's returning. A warlord who says he remembers you. Napoleon's face did not change, but the air around him seemed to tighten. A rival. Claimant. A legend rising in the shadows. He breathed out once, eyes narrowing like a blade being sharpened. Then we will meet him, Napoleon said, and determine which of us the galaxy still has room for. But that was only the beginning. The shadow rival of the new great crusade. The news spread through Gaius Ultima like a sickness. Someone out in the wasteland was rallying forces. Someone with a voice strong enough to cut through static, fear, and the planet's dead air. Someone who claimed to remember Napoleon. We didn't know if he meant in this life or another. But the broadcasts kept coming. And that meant only one thing. Napoleon would want to see it personally. Into the outer wastes. The wastes beyond the city were a graveyard of forgotten industry. Half-sunken manufactorums, broken transit bridges, rust dunes stretching across the horizon like a dead ocean. We traveled in a small armored convoy. No banners, no fanfare, just silence, except for the rattle of engines running far past their intended lifespan. Napoleon sat inside the lead transport, back straight, eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once. The kind of silence you feel rather than hear. I despise empty places, he murmured. Why? One of the officers asked. Napoleon didn't blink. Because emptiness is merely order that surrendered before being challenged. We didn't fully understand it then. We would soon. 2. The broadcast tower. We found the signal source in a desolate valley. A battered Vox tower grafted onto the carcass of an ancient crawler. The structure creaked in the wind, each gust making the metal wail like a dying animal. The local militia refused to approach it. Cursed tower, they said. Voices inside. Lights in the vents. Shadows that move wrong. Usual superstition. Except, superstition on Imperial worlds usually had a reason. When Napoleon stepped toward the tower, the broadcast immediately changed, cutting from static-laced chanting to a calm, unervingly composed male voice. A voice that felt practiced, rehearsed, waiting. I knew you'd come. Napoleon froze mid-step. The tower crackled. You always come eventually. The soldiers shifted uneasily. Napoleon narrowed his eyes. Identify yourself. The response was almost amused. You don't remember me, but I remember you. 3. The voice that should not exist. The tower lights flickered, illuminating faded sigils scratched into the metal. Not chaos runes, but something older. Human. Military. Precise. Napoleon stepped closer, examining them. Campaign markings, he said. Terran style. Pre-heresy era. That alone should have been impossible. A young trooper whispered. Sir, how would markings from the Dark Age even end up here? Napoleon didn't answer. The tower did. Do you ever wonder why you were reborn? The soldiers stiffened. Napoleon's eyes went cold. You are baiting me. No. The voice replied softly. I am reminding you. The tower screens flashed. A symbol appeared. A stylized eagle clutching thunderbolts. Not the Imperial Aquila. Older. Terran. Napoleonic. The air suddenly felt heavier. Even the wind seemed to pause. Napoleon stared at the image. For a moment, just a flicker. A shadow crossed his expression. Recognition, perhaps. Or denial. Then the voice spoke again. I was your rival once. And now, I will be again. For the ambush that wasn't an ambush, the ground trembled. At first, we thought it was seismic instability. Then we realized the truth. Footsteps. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. Marching in perfect rhythm. A column emerged from behind the rust dunes. Silhouettes in the blowing dust. Their armor mismatched but organized. Scavenged but uniform in pattern. A militia shaped into an army. And at their front marched a man. Tall. Rigid. With a posture carved from military doctrine. His uniform was patchworked from Imperial scraps, but the cut was unmistakably old earth. He stopped 20 meters from Napoleon. And bowed. Not mockingly. Formally. Traditionally. General Bonaparte, he said aloud. His real voice, not the broadcast. Napoleon's troops raised weapons instinctively. Napoleon raised a hand. Stand down. He stepped forward, studying the stranger. You, Napoleon said quietly, have no right to address me by that title. The stranger smiled faintly. But you still answered to it. A ripple of unease traveled through us. Napoleon's voice sharpened. Name yourself. The stranger clicked his heels, ancient Terran style. I am Augustus Vale, former commander of the Pan-Human Coalition, historian of your first life. And now, he looked directly into Napoleon's eyes. Your challenger. No weapons raised. No threats. Just two men staring at one another across a dead world. Two leaders, one reborn, one resurrecting his own myth, confronting the truth that history does not tolerate duplicates. Napoleon exhaled slowly. This world, he said, is under Imperial compliance. Augustus Vale nodded. Then let us see which of us wins their loyalty. A beat, a silence, a shift in the air. We felt it. A duel was beginning. Not of swords, not of guns, not of armies, but of destiny. And destiny is the most dangerous battlefield in the Imperium. But that was only the beginning. The day Napoleon and Augustus spoke to a broken world, the meeting with Augustus Vale didn't erupt into battle. It didn't collapse into chaos. It simply hung in the air, like a held breath that refused to release. Two leaders, two visions, two versions of human destiny, and one world caught in the space between them. The city holds its breath. Words spread faster than food, faster than hope, faster than fear. Napoleon met another, a warlord from the wastes, a man who speaks like he lived before the Imperium. In the hives and underhives, people whispered with a strange mix of awe and dread, because when legends appear, ordinary lives tend to become casualties. The manufactorums hummed. The ration lines grew longer. The sky dimmed with gathering storms. And everyone waited to see which legend would claim them. Some swore Napoleon would restore discipline. Others whispered that Augustus Vale spoke with a strange, unsettling certainty. The certainty of someone who didn't fear the Imperium at all. The worst fear was simple. What if both men were right? What if both men were wrong? What if neither intended mercy? The people of Gaius Ultima had endured starvation, neglect, and systemic cruelty, but nothing terrified them more than choices. 2. Napoleon's first address to the people. Napoleon chose to speak first. Not from a palace balcony, not from a military dais, but from a broken water tower overlooking the lower districts, the rusted metal still stained with the fingerprints of workers who had clung to life here. The crowd gathered quietly. Napoleon stood above them, coat whipping in the wind, face lit by the flickering light of failing looming lamps. His voice carried with a measured weight. Your world has been abandoned, not by outsiders, by your own leaders. A murmur. He raised a hand not to silence, but to punctuate. You have survived despite neglect, despite corruption, despite the failures of those who claimed authority. He paused, scanning the faces below. This is not a weakness, he said. It is proof. Proof you deserve better. The crowd leaned forward. Napoleon continued, I do not bring promises. I bring structure. I bring order. I bring the chance to build a world that will not collapse when war touches it, and war touches everything. The words were not warm. They were true. Then came the iron. Follow me and you will endure. A pause. Defy me, and you will perish under the next tyrant who mistakes your silence for consent. The crowd did not cheer. They nodded, slowly, not out of joy, out of recognition. Recognition that he was the first leader they had seen who wasn't pretending. 3. Augustus Vale speaks and changes everything. If Napoleon was order, Augustus Vale was conviction. He chose a different stage, the old transit rails at the wasteland's edge. Hundreds gathered, drawn by rumors of his strange clarity. Augustus stepped onto a broken railcar. His voice carried with unshakable command. You have lived under the Imperium's shadow for so long that you believe suffering is normal. He did not shout. He did not pace. He simply spoke. The Imperium demands obedience, but offers nothing in return. You work. You bleed. You starve. And in the end, you are told your sacrifice was necessary. He pointed back toward the hive city. Necessary for them. The crowd murmured. And then Napoleon comes, Augustus said, telling you he will bring order. He paused. But order under whose hand? Is the Imperium's. A system that has already failed you. A shockwave ran through the listeners. Augustus's voice softened. There is another path. A path where worlds govern themselves. Where leaders are chosen because they earn trust, not because they inherit ranks. He leaned forward. Follow me, and you will not endure. You will decide. Silence. Then whispers. Dangerous ones. 4. Napoleon reacts. When Napoleon heard Augustus's speech replayed, his expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Populism, he said calmly. A tool for those who cannot build. An officer trembled. My lord. His words are spreading. Napoleon turned. Words do not concern me. Another officer hesitated. Then what does? Napoleon stared out the viewport, watching storm clouds gather over the world. The hunger of desperate people, he said. That concerns me, because hunger can become loyalty or rebellion. He clasped his hands behind his back. Prepare for negotiations. The officers blinked. With him, Napoleon nodded. A leader cannot fear a rival. If he does, he has already lost. The meeting arranged neutral ground. A ruined metro station halfway between the city and the wastes. Flickering lights, shattered floors, echoes of centuries-old footfalls haunting the tunnels. Both leaders agreed to arrive with minimal guards. Napoleon brought 6 soldiers. Augustus brought 5. But the air held more danger than any weapons. As the 2 men approached one another in the broken station, dust drifting in shafts of pale light from above, it was clear. This was not a negotiation. It was a battle fought with posture, tone, silence, and purpose. Augustus extended a hand. Napoleon did not take it. Still proud, Augustus said softly. Still calculating, Napoleon replied. Still believing the Imperium can be saved. Still believing you can lead without structure. A faint smile crossed Augustus's lips. Perhaps we were both born in the wrong eras. Napoleon's eyes did not soften. We were born for conflict. And so here we are. They stared at one another. 2 visions. 2 ideologies. 2 paths for humanity. And one world forced to choose. 6. The hook into Chapter 8, the first spark of conflict. Their conversation ended with no agreement. No handshake. No resolution. As they turned to leave, a distant explosion rippled through the tunnels. Muffled, but unmistakable. Napoleon's head snapped toward the sound. Augustus's face hardened instantly. Both men understood. Someone unseen, unknown had just attacked a civilian district. Not Napoleon's forces. Not Augustus's forces. A third actor. A shadow neither had accounted for. A whisper spread through the station. Chaos. Napoleon inhaled sharply. Veil, he said. Did you bring corruption to this world? Augustus's voice turned to ice. No, but something followed you here, Bonaparte. The lights flickered. Screams echoed from far down the tunnel. Both leaders turned toward the darkness. Something moved. Something wrong. The war for Gaius Ultima had just gained a new contender. And that was only the beginning. Chaos arrives on Gaius Ultima. The metro tunnel shook again. Not violently. Not explosively. It shook the way a dying breath rattles in a chest. Subtly, unevenly, but with a quiet inevitability that makes your skin crawl. Napoleon and Augustus shared a single glance. Not friendship, not trust, but a recognition. Whatever was coming did not care about their rivalry. The darkness in the tunnels, the lights flickered. Twice, then held barely, dim, humming, allergic to staying alive. Napoleon signaled his soldiers to secure the perimeter. Augustus did the same. The two groups stayed separate, but their weapons pointed into the same shadows. A faint sound drifted up the tunnel. Not footsteps, not machinery. A whisper. Faint, stretched, like a memory trying to form words. We remember. Napoleon stiffened. Augustus's jaw tightened. The air grew colder. Dust drifted upward as if gravity had forgotten what direction meant. One of Napoleon's soldiers swallowed hard. Sir, permission to activate search lamps? Napoleon shook his head. Darkness reveals more truth than light at times. The whispering continued. A chorus now, soft, layered, unsettlingly human. We remember you, Augustus muttered under his breath. This planet should not have a warp echo this strong. Napoleon replied quietly. No planet should. A distant metallic screech echoed, like something dragging itself along the tunnel wall. Not running, not lunging, just scraping, slowly, deliberately, purposely. 2. The first shapes appeared in the dimness. Not full silhouettes, only faint outlines, flickering, dissolving at the edges as if unsure whether they existed. They moved in jerks. Forward, pause, backward, forward again. Unnatural, wrong. A soldier whispered. Mutants? Augustus answered. No mutant moves like it's remembering how to move. Napoleon stepped forward a single pace. Identify yourselves. The whisper voices responded instantly, overlapping. We are what remains. We are what was forgotten. We are what you left behind. The soldiers tightened their grips on their weapons. Napoleon's expression hardened. I leave nothing behind. The whispering turned sharper, almost amused. Lives were the currency of your campaigns. Memory was your throne. Ambition your weapon. Augustus shot Napoleon a sidelong look. You seem to have admirers in the warp. Napoleon didn't return the glance. They admire suffering, not ambition. 3. The third force reveals itself. The shapes finally stepped into the weak light. They were human, or used to be. Their bodies bore the marks of warp exposure. Nothing explicit or grotesque, but subtle, uncanny distortions. Shoulders slightly too stiff. Eyes unfocused but staring in perfect unison. Movements just a fraction out of rhythm with reality. They looked like people forced into shapes they didn't truly fit. Their leader stepped forward. A gaunt figure in tattered robes, face expressionless, voice echoing like several voices speaking through him. You stand at the threshold. You two fragments of a forgotten age. We have been waiting. Napoleon's voice lowered. For what? The figure answered. For the one who will break this world. Augustus frowned. And which one of us is that supposed to be? The figure's head tilted unnervingly. You ask the wrong question. You should ask, who broke it already? The air tightened. Napoleon's soldier whispered, horrified. They think one of you caused this? Augustus exhaled slowly. They're being manipulated. The robed figure smiled, not warmly. Manipulated. A dangerous word in the Imperium. For the spark of panic before Napoleon could speak again. A tremor rolled through the tunnel walls. Small stones rattled. Rust flakes drifted like falling ash. The robed figure's eyes flickered. Something is waking, it said. Napoleon's soldiers raised weapons. Augustus's soldiers took a step back. The echoing voices whispered faster. Awakening, stirring, claiming, remembering. The robed figure pointed at Napoleon. You are responsible. Napoleon narrowed his eyes. No, the figure pointed at Augustus. Then you are. Augustus's expression darkened. Also no. But the truth hung in the air. Something had been rising under Gaius Ultima long before either of them arrived. And now it had sensed two powerful wills clashing. Two leaders. Two ambitions. Two possible conduits. The tension snapped. The figure's voice rose in a distorted chorus. One of you will feed it. Then suddenly the lights died. Total darkness. Silence. Then a distant roar. Not animal. Not machine. Something deeper. Something ancient. Something hungry. The unthinkable truce in the pitch-black tunnel. Napoleon spoke first. Calm. Controlled. Unshaken. Veil. A beat. Yes. Augustus replied. We cannot fight each other while this thing awakens. Another tremor rolled through the floor. Augustus exhaled. Are you proposing a truce? A temporary one. To survive or to win? Napoleon answered. To choose our battlefield. A roar echoed closer. Dust rained from the ceiling. The whisper voices screamed in unison, dissolving into static and fleeing into the darkness. Augustus said grimly, Then we stand together. For now. Napoleon responded, Then prepare yourself. Whatever is coming is not here for this world. A pause. It's here for us. The roar grew louder. The darkness moved. The tunnel shook. Both legends raised their weapons. But that was only the beginning. The day the Edict of Ashes was proclaimed, the sky above the newly forged Imperial bastion turned the color of burned parchment. Yellowed, cracked, and trembling at the seams. Not from fire, not from smoke, but from something subtler, heavier. The weight of too many whispered fears gathering in one place. Even the wind stayed quiet, as if it didn't want to be caught carrying the wrong sound to the wrong ears. We stood assembled in the main parade square. Thousands of infantry, laborers, administrators, scribes, and whatever passed for faithful citizens in a half-rebuilt fortress world. The stone beneath us was still warm from last night's bombardment. The rubble around us still smelled faintly of dust and ozone. No one spoke, most barely breathed, because Napoleon was stepping forward. The primarchs had stride, the custodes had poise, the commissars had that cold, sharp confidence that made your throat tighten. But Napoleon, he had something different, something unnerving in its simplicity. Purpose. He walked like he had already calculated every one of us, our strengths, our weaknesses, our fears, and had assigned each of us a place in a plan far too big for our minds. The crowd parted instinctively. Not one person dared remain in his path. When he reached the Prometheum-lit dais, he didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't summon lightning, psionics, or holy fire. He simply spoke, and his voice rolled through us like a command sealed into our bones. From this day forward, he began, we march against darkness with fire of our own. Somewhere behind me, a worker whispered a prayer under his breath. I could feel him trembling. Not out of fear, no, it was something stranger. Hope? No, and not hope. Permission. Permission to believe again, even if belief could get you killed. Napoleon continued, pacing slowly, eyes scanning the crowd like a master evaluating chess pieces before the opening move. A crusade requires more than soldiers. It requires conviction, enforced by discipline. The crowd stiffened. Everyone remembered the rumors. New laws, new punishments, new expectations. Rumors in the Imperium usually came true. This sector has survived by accident, he said. But survival will not suffice. We must become worthy of victory. He raised a hand. That was the cue. Servitors clanked forward carrying sealed metal urns. Plain, unadorned, cold. Each bore the sigil of the double-headed eagle freshly repainted with clean, decisive strokes. Napoleon gestured to them. These urns contain the ashes of those who fell defending this world. Silence. Even the air seemed to tense. They are no longer individuals, he continued. They are the foundation of something greater. Their sacrifice will not be mourned. It will be used. He reached down, taking one urn into his hands. It didn't tremble. He didn't tremble. And then, calmly, almost casually, he scattered a thin stream of ash across the parade ground. The ashes swirled, catching faint light, drifting over us like gray snow. Several soldiers bowed their heads. Someone sobbed softly, not because of grief, but because of purpose. Napoleon spoke again, louder now. From this hour, any who fail their duty will join them. Not in honor, in service. It was not a threat. It was simple fact. In his mind, every death was a resource. Fuel for the crusade, material for morale, justification for discipline. The Edict of Ashes. It wasn't written down. It didn't need to be. Soldiers who faltered would be reduced, cremated, and added to the urns. Workers who refused orders would be added to the urns. Traitors, if any were foolish enough to exist, would become part of the ash that paved the path to war. The Imperium had always been cruel. But Napoleon's cruelty wasn't random. It was organized, efficient, cold with purpose. A new kind of terror, a new kind of faith. Then he gave the line that echoed through every corridor, bunker, and trench for days afterward. May the ashes of the unworthy remind you that history remembers only those who endure. A shiver rippled across the entire formation, because history did remember him far too well. And now, in this new galaxy, we began to understand something terrifying. Napoleon Bonaparte had not come here to survive. He had come to win, and he would burn worlds to do it. The ashes drifting through the air settled on our armor, our faces, our tongues. Bitter, dry, unforgettable. And that was only the beginning. The night before the first campaign began, the fortress world felt wrongly calm. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but suspended, like the entire planet was holding its breath, waiting for someone else to exhale first. Even the servitors' monotonous chimes sounded muted, as though the machines themselves sensed that something greater was about to move. I remember standing on the upper ramparts, wind scraping across the stone like a rasp, watching the war camps below. Thousands of tents and prefab shelters stretched across the valley. Tiny squares of flickering light swallowed by darkness. The air tasted of metal, oil, and overboiled recaf. No one slept well. Some didn't sleep at all. Because tomorrow, Napoleon's crusade would march for the first time. The muster that wasn't meant to be seen. Most commanders gather their troops with ceremony, banners, and a show of power. Napoleon did something different. He inspected the army in silence. No trumpets, no speeches, no ceremonial robes or priests proclaiming divine favor. He walked the lines as if walking through a memory he had lived before. He studied faces, human, augmented, exhausted, terrified, one by one. Some men straightened, hoping to impress him. Others avoided his gaze entirely. A few tried to hide their trembling. But he didn't judge bravery or fear. He judged usefulness. You, he said to a young engineer with shaky hands, you will be moved to logistics. Your nerves betray you in battle, but your eyes calculate swiftly. The officer beside him blinked, confused. Napoleon kept walking. To a grizzled veteran missing an arm, you will train the new regiments. You survived 4 campaigns. That is a more valuable weapon than a lost gun. To a clerk who dared step forward and ask why the commissariat had doubled rations only to have them again, Napoleon looked at him for a long moment, then said, because suffering sharpens discipline. And tomorrow we need discipline more than clarity. He moved on, leaving the clerk pale but alive, a rarity in the Imperium. This was Napoleon's gift: cruelty without waste, order without ornament, purpose without pause. The strategium and the shadow on the map much later. Inside the war room, the great holomap flickered with blue and red runes. Generals, tech priests, and administrators ringed the projection, whispering through static-filled voxlinks. The target of their first campaign pulsed with a hostile red sigil, a small frontier world half-swallowed by warp storms. Not a major stronghold, not a strategic treasure, a place the Imperium had written off decades ago. But Napoleon pointed to it with absolute certainty. "We strike here." One of the generals frowned. "My lord, that world's population is unstable. They've been isolated too long. They may not even recognize imperial authority." Napoleon didn't flinch. "Then we will teach them." Another officer hesitated. "The warp storms are unpredictable. Reinforcements could be delayed for weeks. Then we will not require reinforcements." Silence swallowed the room, and in that silence, something settled over the map. Not a shadow from the lights, not a glitch in the hollow projection. Something colder, heavier, like the future itself bending under the weight of a new campaign. Napoleon leaned over the table. "This world will be the first stone in the foundation of the Crusade. And foundations are tested through pressure." The officers exchanged glances. No one dared argue. And then, with a calm almost frightening in its certainty, he added, "We march at dawn." The night of unasked questions back outside. The camps had grown restless. Workers repaired armor plates with shaking hands. Infantry practiced drills in silence. Medics sorted supplies by candlelight, pretending not to notice how little they had. The chaplains whispered litanies they weren't sure they believed. Everyone sensed it. Tomorrow we would become something else. Not citizens. Not soldiers. Not survivors. Instruments. Tools of a man whose mind moved like a storm front. Inevitable, cold, unstoppable. And yet, in a quiet corner of the camp, I saw something unexpected. A young conscript, barely older than me, writing a letter home. His hands shook, but not from fear. From determination. When he noticed me watching, he gave a weak, awkward smile. "My sister likes hearing about the sky," he said. "I told her it's clear tonight." That felt important. He wasn't wrong, because the sky was clear. For the last time in a long time, the stars looked like frozen sparks ready to fall on us. The moon hung low, pale as bone. And in the far distance, barely visible, the planetary shields flickered, as if preparing to close one chapter and open another. Colder one, a darker one written in ash, not ink. And as the camp lights dimmed, and the last engines warmed for the march, a single truth settled over all of us. The crusade wasn't beginning tomorrow. It had already begun the moment Napoleon rose from the ashes of another life. And the galaxy had no idea what was coming.